I think we can go ahead and get started, because I know a few folks are kind of running between some different things, but you know, Blair, you can keep the lines open, let people come in and join as they get settled in, and and we'll go from there, because I know you've got some great ground to cover. So we're thrilled that we're going to have this intense conversation with you today, and looking forward to some hot audience participation. I know a lot of different layers around this, right? I remember the first time I met you, and I was telling one of our interns, Sachi, I think she's on this call with us now, that I think we met each other because I found an article you had written. Oh, wow. This is no lie, on LinkedIn about leadership. And I love the concept, and I love the way people show up as leaders. And so I had read this and I was like, I got to meet this guy. I got to meet this guy. So I believe I just messaged you, if I'm not remembering this wrong. Yeah, no, and absolutely. You replied and you said, yeah, I'd love to talk. And then since then I've met so many cool people, including Hakeem, because of you. Absolutely. So I love how these things just happen. Like, the right people come into your universe when they're supposed to.
Right.
And we have the right conversations because we lead with our intention. So thank you for being a great leader. Thank you for being a man in your space that is disruptive and proactive and honest and real. And all that being said, I think that's the best way to introduce you, is just serendipitously how we met. So feel free to just take it over, and I'll be walking through a little bit of the chat bot for you, or chat box. We'll kind of man that on the production side, and have a great conversation. Welcome, Ulysses, to athLEDA Live.
Wow, that's just such an awesome introduction. I think you're pretty spot on with how we got introduced, and LinkedIn is pretty powerful. So I like to keep lines open when anyone reaches out, like Jelana did. And I had a pleasure of viewing a keynote.
You want to use my phone?
Things that you put up.
Use my phone.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So yeah, without a doubt, just happy to meet via LinkedIn, and then also just get involved with any way that I can here. So, and the other thing, I am on my hotspot, and sometimes it does get a little frozen. My internet gets a little choppy. So if that happens, feel free to blurt anything out, or just use the chat or whatever it may be. Sounds good?
Yeah.
Very good. So, and the other thing too is I do have another screen here that I'm looking at, so I'll be kind of going back and forth here. But today's topic that Jelana asked me to speak about is the inequities in cannabis. And as she mentioned, that's kind of how we met. I am currently a professor of cannabis at Clark University. I also teach entrepreneurship and innovation at undergraduate school at Clark University. And then I'm the co-founder of Major Bloom. So this location that I'm at right now, that's semi under construction, is one of my marijuana establishment locations outside of Boston, here in Worcester, Massachusetts. So if anyone's familiar with Worcester, you might pronounce it Worcester. The phonetics are a little messed up, but not too far from Boston, not too far from Providence, and happy to be here. So the primary topics that we'll touch on today are all around cannabis, some of the simple facts that come with cannabis, some of the problems that are within cannabis. I think it's important to delineate those problems as social problems and then market problems, because they are in relation to each other, but they also have two different, I don't want to say requirements, but solutions, or multiple solutions for those issues. We'll talk about community needs as a whole, a little bit of personal stories mixed in there, and then addressing the inequities that still exist today, presently, in this time that we're in, even though we see a lot of states that are opening up to cannabis commerce. So there was a really cool picture here. I don't know why it's not, other than my face on the left side, I don't know why it's not showing, but whatever. All right, cool. So some of the cannabis facts. I think it's important to start with the most generic and basic one, is that no one has ever died from cannabis. No one's ever overdosed from cannabis. And, arguably so, people will say that cannabis is not addictive. So, that's not the statement or the fact that I'm trying to, convey here, but just know that, no one has died, from cannabis. And it's pretty simple. Currently, cannabis sits as a Schedule I drug, and that is regulated by our federal government. It has been since 1970. I believe President Nixon was the president that helped push that into Schedule 1 drugs. And for those that don't know, that means that cannabis sits next to cocaine and heroin in terms of the addictive factors of it and in terms of not having any medicinal value. Now, I skipped to the next one, which is considered the patent that the federal government has on cannabis. So it's just contradictory there. And I'm not here to talk about any, what's the word I'm looking for? Wow, I'm lost of words. Conspiracies. But the fact is, the federal government says that there's no medicinal use, but then we go down to the United States Department of Health and Human Services that has a patent on the same substance, the same drug, the same plant, to say that it does have some medicinal value. So this leads experts and people that are involved in the industry and even people, the citizens of the United States to say that without a doubt, cannabis should be federally legal. Right now, as it stands, there's 33 states that have access to cannabis or even have decriminalized it. And, it's probably going to be in our lifetime, within the next 10 years, that we'll see some kind of federal regulation behind cannabis. So, but I always think it's interesting that they say it has no medicinal value, but then the U.S. government has a patent on it. That's actually the patent number. I'm not a patent attorney, nor do I know a lot about patents, but I just know that that number is pretty straightforward with what the United States government is doing with cannabis.
So Ulysses, as you jump into that a little bit, can you help us with a little bit of that backstory? Which administration started perhaps the war on drugs? I've watched a little bit about that, understand a little bit about that particular part of our nation's history. And could you take us into perhaps where all of that got started? And maybe you're going to do that and I've just kind of taken away your thunder, but I think it's important for us to understand where we've come and perhaps where the criminalization of this plant started. Perhaps what were the factors that drove that and what administration filtered that into our consciousness?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I touched on a little bit with President Nixon. He definitely was the champion in terms of political leadership that really took a strong hold. And we never look back in terms of mass incarceration. In fact, that's where we saw the large spike in mass incarceration. Was Nixon carried over to the presidents that exist, even with Bill Clinton in the 90s. We saw a substantial rise. But prior to Nixon, he's definitely not the only leadership person in federal government to help get there. And I want to say 1937, there was the DEA was formed, and there was a really, really racist guy named his name was Harry Anslinger, and he, like I said, was racist. He really just didn't care for people of color, and I'm not just talking black people. I'm talking about Latinx and Latinas, people of Mexican descent. Anyone that's basically not of European descent or white as we call it. So with him heading the DEA, he made a strong campaign to shoot down what people commonly know as cannabis being used in the medicinal place, because prior to 1937, it was used, doctors prescribed cannabis. It was also used to create paper. It was also used for industrial materials. But there was a group of individuals led by the DEA and led by our, at the time, Harry Anslinger, and I forgot the other gentleman's name, but he basically had a monopoly on the newspaper industry and did not want, basically hemp to make its way into mass production to compete with newspapers. So it was a conglomerate of folks before Nixon, but Nixon definitely took and put it in front of the public eyes from a presidential standpoint, where the DEA in 1937 really did it from, I would say, a psychological standpoint and putting out propaganda around it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. Thank you.
All right, cool. Absolutely. So just diving into some personal, and I try to make this a little bit more personal, partly because I am an athlete, and for me, my cannabis kind of experience intersects with me being an athlete and a student athlete and getting to college, and then some of the trouble I got into college because of it. But long story short, I got introduced to cannabis when I was 14 years old, and at that time, I also got introduced to football and a family business. So ultimately what that did is that it it gave me other legs to stand on and not really defer to what was going on, just, you know, in terms of like the older kids that were running around with cannabis and, you know, basically the woes that you can get into as a teenage kid, especially being a Black teenage kid. So I'm really fortunate to have the experience to work for a family business that introduced discipline. And with that discipline that I had in my life, it also came a lot of freedom. Because ultimately, you know, when I was on job sites, you know, I basically had cannabis with me, you know, almost 24/7 by the time I was able to drive. So I think that gave me what the plant does and who are the people that use the plant. And I can make a strong argument to say that the representation of cannabis is legal through the causation of being around those other drugs. So I mentioned the heroin, the cocaine. So even though those substances don't have the same effects, but because they're both illegal in Schedule I, they get clumped together. And, you know, you might have someone who, you know, is a cannabis dealer, but also can get their hands on cocaine or heroin because they're all legal, not because the plants or the substances are in relation. So I think that's a strong misconception that people have in their minds now, because it's, just because it's federally legal, and, you know, that's not the way it should be. So as I mentioned before, I got introduced as a teenager, and I realized that it really brought people together. Cannabis brought people together. You know, I grew up in a middle class neighborhood. So I realized that, you know, the $1 million homes, you know, 10, 15 minutes away from my house, you know, those kids use cannabis, and the kids that live in the projects 10, 15 minutes away from me, they also use cannabis. So it made sense that it allowed people to be in a creative space, allowed people to, you know, help with physical ailments, help with mental ailments. And it was more or less therapeutic and not, you know, a gateway drug that's been pushed down our throats for the past, you know, 50, 60 years. And then on the bottom here, I have two statistics. So right now in America, you know, Black people are 4 times likely to get arrested for cannabis, even though white and Blacks use it at the same rate. If we introduce Latinas and Latinx, that number increases. And then it goes down to the ownership as well. The ownership of these legal cannabis dispensaries and operations, only 4% are owned by Blacks. It might even be less than that. But yeah, so basically that's what stood out to me, is like the correlation between the arrest rate to what, you know, the ownership stake is, as well as even just the workforce. The workforce is not very diverse across the nation as well when it comes to cannabis. And we know that, you know, Blacks and Latinos and Latinx have been you know, harmed the most when it comes to cannabis prohibition. So
any thoughts around the factors that have contributed to that, Ulysses? Like, if you were to hypothesize, I know this is part of what you studied, you've built your brand on this, you're an entrepreneur. What would you say, what would you propose as a hypothesis for the discorrelation between the amount of arrest and yet the amount of folks who are entrepreneurs or monetizing this industry, right? That's kind of the weird dichotomy that we're discussing here.
Absolutely. So there's no question that it's systemic racism. I mean, that's what it's all rooted in. And we look at the criminalization of the plant, which ultimately led into the criminalization of Black and brown people. And then now we see that, you know, most licenses are going to, you know, white men. And, you know, that's systemic barriers of, from many cases, from real estate to access to capital to political clout, you know, all that is basically part of this large system that's just deep rooted in systemic racism. So that's the short answer to the question. But there's definitely other factors other than the criminalization of cannabis, because we talk about like redlining that happened after Jim Crow, you know, basically when desegregation was down, and you basically clump together these Black and brown neighborhoods. And now what that does is it gives police, local police, means to basically ride down and over police these communities. And that's why we see the spike in arrests being mostly from Black and browns, because the police were over policing those areas. But they wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for Jim Crow laws and basically segregation and redlining with, you know, mortgages back in the 60s and 70s, and still what we see today, but basically, you know, segregating, or even though we're in a desegregated society. So there's a lot of levers, but like I said, it's all related to a system of racism.
Wow.
So it's pretty weighty stuff. I don't want to think I'm like super serious all the time. but like, this is a serious topic, you know, and it's a lot because it's happening right now in front of us, very present day. Like, you know, that's why I'm just happy to be here and you know, be able to share with you guys. So. All right. So looking at some market information, I personally believe that cannabis can be somewhat of a substitute for some of these industries, the pharmaceuticals, alcohol, and tobacco. Now, I'm not saying that we should get rid of all drugs, all tobacco, all alcohol. I don't believe in that. I love champagne. I love a good glass of champagne. You know, I do. You know, I've gotten a couple toothaches and needed to take some pharmaceuticals that the drug that my dentist gives me. So I'm not here again on a conspiracy. I just like to look at the bigger picture that, you know, the pharmaceutical, alcohol, and tobacco sales, you know, it's a lot, and marijuana is still in its infancy right now. So we look at that $30 billion number, and that's projected. You know, it really could be, you know, marching in a way that is going to continue to grow and to catch up with these sectors, which scares some people, to be honest with you. It does scare a lot of people. But I think if you embrace it and really understand it, then, you know, it's part of the society getting better and not depending more on, you know, on pharmaceutical drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. So,
yeah. Well, there certainly is a, well, and I think there's a couple of different educators, and I know that I would count you among them, that have discussed how really, if you follow the dollar, a lot of these answers become really clear, right? Because there is a market share, and there are legislators, there are bodies of influence that control the market policies that govern. Right. I am a pharmaceutical alumnus, and so I worked in pharma for 4 years. And so I understand quite well the way that the FDA regulates pharmaceuticals. I understand the policies and the macro laws that are governing that space. And so there are, if we look at this from a economic lens, a lot of answers to be had. And I'm certain you would agree with that.
Yeah, and I would say that kind of leads to the disparities that exist now, because those same companies that are well capitalized for the lobbyists that help policy are the ones that are also doing the same, if not in the same format, to help write the policies for legalized cannabis at the state level, at the local level. So that's where a lot of the disparities lie in, is that, you know, when you don't have big lobbyist groups to help write those regulations, then you tend to leave out the ones who have been harmed by prohibition. And we're seeing that right now as it exists. So that's a great point. So some of the problems with cannabis, and just kind of taking a step back from, I guess, cannabis as a whole, but if we look at the U.S. in, you know, in its entirety, just as we exist as a society, you know, we do have the largest prison population on the planet. And as I mentioned, it kind of started leaning towards that way in the 1970s at the Nixon administration. And then, you know, definitely skyrocket in the 90s. You know, I'm a child of the 90s. I was born in 88. So, you know, I kind of lived through that, as well as my father. You know, he had some run-ins with the law early on and really, you know, turned his life around. But I look at it from the perspective of anyone that lived through those times. You know, it's just the fact that you can't really, they're not at fault, because the evidence leads that the government and local governments really push this to happen. You know, the fact that, you know, the majority of folks that have been locked up for marijuana are Black people, are people of color, are brown people. So there's empathy that we have to have and recognize as a society towards that, and not just be so quick to spend money with these big conglomerates in the marijuana space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But out of all the arrests for drug possession, around 50% are for marijuana possession. I think this is even more astonishing when we dive into who's been arrested for marijuana, but what for. So we look at nearly 90% of people that have been arrested for marijuana are for possession and nonviolent. What that means that someone was carrying a dime, or probably in the 90s, a nick, $5 worth of weed, $10 worth of weed, $20 worth of weed. You know, basically not distributing. We're not talking about, if anyone's familiar with Big Meech and Black Family Mafia, like those are kingpin guys. You know, you think of your El Chapos and like all these big guys that you make documentaries off of and movies off of. Those are the guys. And actually recently I interviewed a DEA agent from my class that's now in the cannabis industry. And he kind of attested to that. The federal government really was in a position to write the laws and then unleash the local government. So your local, your local police departments to come down on these neighborhoods. So I can't say that the federal government enacted this, but they supported it by allowing the local guys to lock people up for dimes and nicks and $20 worth of weed. So, and there are people still to this day in jail right now for having, $20 worth of weed, $40 worth of weed. And again, they're not, in a position to be the kingpins. And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. So then diving a little bit more into the details here. So about 40% of people incarcerated right now, and that's just for everything, whether it be, different violations, but 40% of that are people of color. The number likely increases if we consider Latinas as well. I think it's around 60%, and even though we only make up 13% of the United States there as far as Black Americans, African Americans. So it's an astonishing statistic, and it's it's one of those things that again, it's so present that it's really tough to kind of put your head around and wrap your head around. But that's kind of why I'm in this position that I'm in, partly because, I believe that there's a way that we can reverse all this. And, we'll talk about that down the line here as we progress here. So not to bore you guys with statistics, but it's just, that's just what it is. So some of the other problems that we face in cannabis is access to cannabis. Now, when I say access, I think more of the patients. So there are people who do use, as I mentioned before, cannabis for therapeutic reasons. And now what we're starting to get to is more debilitating reasons. So someone could have anxiety or could have PTSD for something maybe in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, and they know that cannabis helps. Now we're starting to get to research where cannabis can help for pain. Cannabis can help for epilepsy, all these different seizures and, all these different, ailments. And now this is why we're starting to see more of a medical market take shape. But the problem with having that medical market is that they look at patients only and say, hey, we want to deal with that problem now. And usually when people think medical, they don't think back into the harms that have been done by prohibition. So when I say community access, I mean it from a patient perspective, but then also from a perspective of those who have been harmed by prohibition as well. Now, the bureaucratic license and regulations at a state and local level, since it's not federally legal, states have the ability to do whatever they want, which makes it super interesting. California has way different regulations than Massachusetts. California, Colorado, all these different states on the West where it's very saturated and it's very normal. It's very normal to have cannabis. Out here on the East Coast, they're a little bit slower because they want to learn from those mistakes of other states. So I'll give you an example. Colorado was the first state in the United States, and that was in 2014 to have recreational marijuana, and they do not have social equity programs. They do not have restorative justice programs. Again, we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's important because they have 6 years of commerce and they don't have the infrastructure to say, hey, we want to give back to those who have been harmed, which is a little messed up. But you look at a state like Massachusetts and where I'm at right now, their top of mind is to say, okay, if we're going to legalize it, we want to figure out a way to restore those issues. Now, I will say that no state is doing it correctly at this point. I'm even in a social program here in Massachusetts, and it's still very challenging. And yeah, like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But, what happens is all these different states, they learn from each other. So, we learn from what happened in Colorado. We learn from what happened in California and then try to institute new regulations to make things better. And then the last step is that I think people are in a position, again, because of all the misinformation that we've been fed, to separate the opioid crisis with legalization. I personally know friends and family who have used cannabis to help them get off of, more prescription drugs or more specifically opioid, with the, I grew up around it. I grew up with kids that, played sports and ultimately got injured and, their doctor prescribed them to a bunch of medicines and then they couldn't get off them. So at that same token, I know that cannabis is going to help. And we talk about what is it? Wow, I can't think of it. Like NFL players that have these head traumas. I know cannabis is a way to help with that, but yet, the NFL and all these different organizations don't want to, basically recognize that yet. So, again, from my experience, I know that cannabis can help. And we're just not there yet to make it be known without the misinformation that we get from.
Were you talking about concussions, Ulysses?
Yeah. The C, is it C? What is it?
CTE.
PTE.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So
yeah, we have athletes in our network that have suffered with the symptoms related to that, and I personally know of athletes who have found cannabis to be a way to overcome those symptoms and to restore health after a traumatic concussion related set of series of injuries, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's making some headway. I can't remember exactly what the NFL agreed to do. Maybe it was, and actually Eric Martin was the one that told me something along those lines when we spoke a couple weeks ago, that NFL is now starting to look into research. So I think it's going to come around without a doubt. It's just that, like, we can't think in our minds that, this thing, marijuana is bad, essentially. We got to get rid of that stigma. So, and I think it's very important to pull in that athlete population. Because like I said, for a while, even at the high school and college level, a lot of these athletes are fed, drugs to help get over injuries and stuff. So, it's important to recognize that.
Hey, Ulysses, can I ask a question before you roll on?
Mm-hmm.
Is cannabis and marijuana still considered or still a Schedule I drug? And if so, I'm sure there has to be movements to regulate that in a different way or have it reclassified?
No, it hasn't been, not yet. And I did mention that in the beginning. I hope you guys caught that. But yeah, it is still Schedule I, again, which is right next to heroin and cocaine. And they say that there's, any Schedule I drug, it means that it doesn't have medicinal value. But again, the contradictory statement there is that the government has a patent on a certain type of marijuana. So I think at some point it's gonna happen and declassify itself. But I just, I'm not the one to predict when it's gonna happen. I just know it's probably gonna be in our lifetime. So.
I did read something last night, just doing some research for the talk today, and I did find out that the NCAA has raised the amount of limits that they would use to sanction an athlete for the use of cannabis. Now, that doesn't mean that they've essentially agreed to its use, whether it be medicinally or recreationally, but they have raised the limits that they authorize as within fair protocols for active NCAA athletes.
Absolutely.
So we have a number of NCAA athletes on the call, so I thought I'd share that.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think, Hakeem, just going back to Hakeem, he's one of the people that shed a lot of light on like the NFL's use. And like, he's basically telling me like 90% of guys, use it and they find a way to get around it. So I think it's the same with college athletes too, is that if you really need it and you feel like it helps, figure out a way to, and I hate to say it, but like the NFL guys do it. They figure out a way to pass their drug test and carry on, I'm definitely not promoting it, I'm just saying that it can be done because guys, use it for their benefit. So
for sure.
It's a great point.
For sure. Camille just made a point, and I was going to ask her to add a little bit more to it, but she was just saying that it's kind of interesting how different the conversations between alcohol and cannabis are, the use of alcohol versus the use of marijuana. And again, I try not to even use the term marijuana because I understand that was the DEA's effort to criminalize the drug in the post Jim Crow era. So I often try to call it cannabis because that is its true form. But I do agree with her that there is an interesting set of perceptions around the way we've normalized alcohol at a certain age, but yet there's still a lot of misperceptions around the positive use of cannabis. And I think that's what Camille was calling to mind.
Yeah, sorry, I wrote marijuana only because I saw it on the message above me, but sorry about that. I definitely won't use that word in the future.
It's all good. No, it's good. It's part of the learning, right? Right. I just learned that recently. So
and it's still tough. It's still tough to separate it.
For sure. For sure.
So yeah, I think, and that's a good segue into kind of what are the needs of not only the community, but I think just the public. And that, to your point, that like we are so used to alcohol and prescription drugs that like we don't necessarily like bat an eye at it. But I think there is an unbiased education that needs to happen. And it starts from the perspective of the wrongs that have been done. And then we move on to the fact that, you know, again, no one has died from cannabis, and it's actually medicinal value. So these are ways that we can look at, you know, destigmatizing, you know, what cannabis and marijuana and, you know, does to communities and what it does to individuals that use it. You know, part of the other needs are the fact that restorative justice, it needs to be top of mind at the local, state, and federal level. So I can dive into that a little bit more. Here is the fact that, you know, Massachusetts was the first state to come up with a social equity program, and that's the state level. And we're starting to see some cities, some major cities around Massachusetts. So like Worcester, the city that I live in, Somerville, you know, Cambridge, all these cities that are close to Boston's even considering, you know, really putting in restorative justice policies so that we have some at the state level, but then we can also recognize them at the local level. And I think that's more important than anything else, you know, where we don't have to wait for the federal government to enact these policies and then trickle down, is that you can really take a strong hold now and really make some change, you know, locally where you live. And then the last point of, I would say for you know, the needs is really be cautious and intentional about the licensing process. What happened here in Massachusetts is that a lot of West Coasters, no shots at people at the West Coast, from Colorado, from California, from Oregon, even from Canada, come down, and what they want to do is set up shop, take their profits and go back to where they came from. They don't necessarily care about restoring the issues that are inherent here in the local community. So that's one thing I really take pride in, the fact that I teach cannabis in the city where my business is in Worcester, and the fact that I've been paying taxes here, owning my house, and they're all within a 5-10 minutes radius of each other. So I really take pride in that, partly because I know that my company, we're up against some multi-billion-dollar companies that are right down the street, you know, and we got to fight the good fight as the underdog, essentially. So I take a lot of pride in that. And I think anyone should too, you know, in their own local community. Again, we don't have to wait for a federal government to really take control of our narrative here locally. So,
Hakeem, can you talk a little bit more about restorative justice programs? I'll tell you, that's a new word for me. I'm going to own the fact that my awareness and my education has come from living on the West Coast. And so I'm not as in tuned to what you're describing, but I do think that there is a restorative justice need across many different communities. And we need to we all need to take a look at what that looks like for each one of us and our call to action around that. So I just like to know, and maybe you're going to talk about that, but I'd love for you to provide us with a tangible set of next steps.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's restorative justice for cannabis. It's commonly known as social equity programs, and it's really depends on, like in California, they do it at a local level and they do it at a county level. So like LA, the city of LA is just now getting to, you know, institute ways to create more diversity and inclusion in their cannabis licensing, while also helping to guide and aid those areas that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. Here in Massachusetts, we did studies on, I believe it's 29 cities in Massachusetts. So you got your Boston was #1, the city that I'm in now, Worcester's #2. And if any of you guys are familiar with like New Bedford, Lawrence, you know, these are predominantly Black and brown communities. So the problem is, when we say restorative justice, it would be troubling. I shouldn't say troubling. It would be, I guess, against the Constitution for anyone to say, or for any agency to say, I want to help out Black and brown people. So what they do is they come up with all these different criterias to say, hey, we want to help out this area. And that area is predominantly Black and brown people, but they don't say that, hey, that's our target, you know? So when we talk about restorative justice, it's restoring those communities from that capacity of saying, hey, they've been harmed by prohibition the most, and now what we want to do is repair or restore that by, you know, offering incentives or initiatives to help, basically push that community forward. And I think it's, what we don't talk about a lot, and actually in the next slide, I'll talk about a little bit more about the programs here locally, is that, psychologically is probably the most devastating issue with all that's going on now. And, pretty much it comes down to a lot of finance and like how money is going to get pushed back into these communities. But I think it's much greater than that. I think restorative justice is really psychological, because it's a lot that we deal with and we look at and kind of just to go through, to be honest with you. So, but yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about restorative justice in the next slide. But I hope that answers, some of the question there.
Yeah, for sure. That's good. I'm just trying to think about it like from the notion of, what do I do today, tomorrow, next week? How do I think differently? How do I communicate to the people around me who might have an opportunity to hear something that they've not heard before? How do we push the education and awareness? But yes, love it.
Yeah, and I think it's living it, to be honest with you. I had the opportunity last week to interview a really good friend of mine who happened to be the director of social equity program or the director of outreach for our Cannabis Control Commission, which is the governing body, the state governing body for the administrations of license and law enforcement within cannabis. So her job was to roll out a social equity or restorative justice program. And, one of the biggest takeaways I got from interviewing her last week was that you literally have to live it. You know what I mean? You can't hire people to delegate and run social equity programs or restorative justice programs if they don't live it, if they come from a place of privilege. You know what I mean? You have to look and get advice from people who have been through it. And I think that's where a lot of states are actually failing. A lot of programs are failing, is because they don't get impact from people. They don't get input from people who have been impacted by prohibition. So yeah, I think actually living it and wanting to live it is a big factor to help, understanding and pushing forward with restorative justice. And that's not just cannabis. That is across many different disciplines, So,
If I could
So-
jump in for a second, like Ulysses making really good points about like you have to live it, and so often, like you said, you'll get like initial buy-in from people, say, oh yeah, let's have an equity agenda, and they're just thinking, okay, great, this is something that we can put on our website and it looks good and we won't ever have to work on it again. But continuous space for reflection and development. This has to be something that all orgs are willing to make foundational, which is rare, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. And that's why, it sucks to say that it's really failing across the nation, to be honest with you. Restorative justice is failing across the nation. But that doesn't mean that, again, being really present, we all, need to be in a position to do our part to make things better. And again, we'll talk about that in probably in the next slide. But, and thank you, Nick, for joining in there. So with the community perspective, this is a little bit more personal to my experience. I touched on a little bit, like getting introduced to cannabis at a young age, and then, ultimately having the discipline from a strong support system from my family business. And I would also say that's the same with sports. I played sports, from the time I could remember as a kid. And I happened to get introduced to the sport of football and cannabis by the same kid back home, a little bit older than me. We went to the same church. We basically were brothers. He's no longer with us due to some issues back home with, issues that happen in our community. So he's a strong motivating factor for me, because I would not have gotten to college if it wasn't for football. I could tell you that I was a very personable kid, but I grew up with a disability. And I graduated high school, damn near at an elementary school reading level. So the fact that I was good at football, it helped me get into college. Ultimately, my grades were so bad my freshman year, I didn't get a chance to play clearinghouse. I'm sure you athletes are familiar with that you got to pass clearinghouse, especially coming out of high school to college. They look at your SAT scores, which mine were also horrible. They look at your GPA, also horrible. But I just had the ability to network with people and really take a strong hold in the resources that were provided for me. So it's not like I was a troublemaker. I just really couldn't grasp the concepts that were there at a young age for me, prior to going into graduate school. So I got the word rapper here. You guys are probably wondering what does that mean? So I actually got kicked out of college for marijuana. Like I said, I redshirted my freshman year, and then I came back my sophomore year technically my freshman year of being an athlete. And I started the first couple games, had a pretty good experience there. Then I ended up getting hurt. I didn't finish out the season because of my ailments, and I decided that I didn't want to play sports anymore. So when I had quit football, I was getting some money from my college. They actually, kicked me out of school. What that ultimately did from me getting, well, let me back up a little bit. Sorry. So I got kicked out of my dormitory because my room smelled like cannabis. Now, I was not happy about that because they did search my room and they didn't find anything. So I do consider myself as someone who's been impacted by prohibition because, for them to have no causation to kick me off campus, it ultimately led to a plethora of other things that I ended up getting in trouble for. So now I'm off campus. I no longer play football. And I also got arrested by the city police here in Worcester. Not only did I get arrested, actually, I got jumped by the police. So very, relevant to what the times are now. Basically, as a popular athlete, people that knew people, I had a lot of people at my house that, basically my neighbors called disturbing the peace on me. And when the cops came, I ended up getting into a scuffle with them where they beat me up. So this is all stemmed from cannabis. Me getting kicked out of my dormitory to having to live into the second most populated city in New England. And then the police force here is not the greatest police force. So that led to me getting arrested and beat up by the police. And I was devastated. I thought I wanted to actually quit college and figure out a way to, make ends meet. And that's when I started rapping. I started writing a lot of lyrics, and it was a way for me to express myself. So my mom at the time, God bless her heart, she's like, you could still rap, you could still write your raps, but I want you to stay in school. So I ended up staying in school. It took me a long time to get through a 4-year degree. It took me almost 7 years, 6.5 years. But she was the strong influence in my life. While I'm writing raps thinking I'm going to blow up and be the next, Jay-Z or Lil Wayne, she's like, you know what, why don't you study business? And, you worked the family business for the past 10 years. You got to choose an area of discipline or a major to get into. And that's when it all clicked. And I got to thank my mom for that because, prior to that, when you're in college, you study all these generic things because they want you to. But then you really have to make a decision on where the rest of your life's going to be. So for me, in the transition from being an athlete my entire life, and the next best thing I knew was like, all right, I'm gonna do this as being a rapper. But my mom was like, all right, reel it in and be more realistic and get an education in business because you also have some knowledge of business as well. So thanks to my mom for helping to make that click. And I think what I took, transferred from being an athlete into having a successful career in the academic world and now being able to be an entrepreneur, have my own marijuana establishment, is that, the biggest attributes of being an athlete, a student athlete, or playing sports is teamwork, motivating others and being able to accept help. And I think I learned that also from being a child with a learning disability, that like there are always going to be resources around you. You just got to figure out how to use those resources. So, I learned that probably, like I said, when I really started to kick things into gear in my college career. And after I finished undergraduate, I decided to stay directly into graduate school and get my MBA from Northeastern, and that helped propel my entrepreneurship journey, and then also being a professor. So, and like Jelana mentioned, I do write blogs now. I am currently in the middle of writing a book now for my business as well. So, if it wasn't for kind of all those life experiences with, again, playing athletics and having a strong network of friends that I can depend on, being in relation to cannabis, learning how to get over my disability and my learning disability, having a strong support from my family and my mother. And then now, being in a position to, really do some good things as an entrepreneur, it all kind of stems together with like, being able to just, there's going to be people that want to help you, and you got to learn how to take that help. So, very, very fortunate, I would say, and to be in the position that I am right now.
Wow.
So,
what I think stands out. Yeah. What I love about this, Ulysses, is your resilience stands out because there are so many things that you could have done and just said, nope, I'm over it. I've been impacted. There's been injustice in my life. There have been people I love affected, and I'm just not going to continue to find my way through this. But you did lean in. I wrote on the chat, God love mamas that just continue to promote the right things for all of us and people in our lives, right? Not just our parents, but oftentimes our friends, the people that really see our value and our potential and our worth. And it sounds like you've surrounded yourself with some really strong people that have been part of that team for you. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I would say, and we'll talk a little bit more about it too, but like the fact that I have 4 sisters, you know, and I would say, I always joke that I work the hardest in the family, because growing up, I was the one that did all the labor. You know, my sisters are home, like chilling. Meanwhile, I'm out making money chilling. But I took pride in that, and that's the motivating factor now. You know, as my business partner for Major Bloom is a female who also has four sisters. And I even in my corporate career, when I was a sales manager and sales leadership, you know, I made sure that, like, you know, women in the workplace, you know, they were heard, and there's value there, because you know, there's just a lot. When we talk about race, we talk about sex in the workplace. There's just so much that, like, you know, is untapped right now, and there's a lot of upside for us in the future if we use the right resources and the right tools to help progress, you know, us as a society. So, yeah, not to digress into, you know, I guess, you know what I mean, like the whole female talk and the race talk, but
no,
yeah,
let's definitely. Yeah, let's revisit that again, because there's a whole lot more there to be uncovered for sure.
Absolutely. So just going back to your question, Jalon, a little bit about the restorative justice. So like I said before, the state of Massachusetts was one of the first states to put in a social equity or economic empowerment program at the inception of going legal for adult use cannabis. So typically what happens is these states, they either decriminalize or they introduce a medical market. But with those two, decriminalization and medical markets, there typically isn't social equity provisions that are written. They're like, all right, let's focus on patient.
Oh no. Oh. There you go. Wait, I think you're on mute. Yeah. Yeah, we see your red little mute button is still on, man.
Sorry about that, guys.
That's all right. That's all right. There we go.
All right.
Hey, it's not fun if you don't have to overcome some kind of technical challenge, right? That's just how we roll. It's all good. That's right. Same.
You guys can see the screen here, right?
Yes. Yeah. Addressing inequities. Yes. Perfect.
All right, cool. So yeah, and this goes back to what you were talking about a little bit, Jelana, is like, what is restorative justice? And it is in some way a way of reparations, especially when we talk about, you know, Black and Brown people being the most impacted by prohibition. Then, you know, it's just a fancy word for reparations, to be honest with you. So I think a lot of people don't look at it that way, but, you know, it certainly is in a format of reparations. Now, just diving a little bit more into the economic empowerment program, that's the program that me and my company and my business partner are in. Basically, we fit the criteria for folks who have worked in communities that have been impacted by prohibition. What else? We displayed, you know, basically a business plan to work with these communities. So because we had and fit these criteria when legalization rolled out, they deemed our business, you know, economic empowerment. Now, what does that mean? In the realism of things is that a lot of, like I mentioned before, out-of-state folks, a lot of big money folks, even people that have money within the state, they have access to all these lawyers, to all these policies, to all these, you know, persuasive and influential regulatory, you know, agencies and all these different resources to help and put an application in faster than someone that I can. Someone like me that I can. So basically what the state has done is they said, okay, if you have this economic empowerment certificate, now you have access for us to review your application faster. In theory, you can get licensed faster. So that's all it really is expedited licensing is the program that I'm in. I will say that there's still challenges, partly because, you know, the access to capital. And this isn't just cannabis. This isn't just cannabis. If I were to start a business, it would be a lot more difficult for me to get a loan, or even women to get a loan, white women to get a loan, or go to a PE firm or private equity firm, or a venture capital firm, or even just an institutional bank. Like inherently, these things are more difficult for women, for people of color. Now you throw on cannabis is another layer, so that is where the inequity still lies in many different states, and especially here in Massachusetts, where there isn't access to capital. Luckily, I've been very, very fortunate. And again, I am very good at taking help. When you would look at like the construction that's done here, this is a kid I played college football with. Him and I distinctly remember him running on the field and meeting him. He was a senior when I was a freshman. And this kid, he does well. I was attracted to him and his story because he also started a business with his dad that he still operates now here in Massachusetts. And mind you, I'm from Connecticut, so I moved up to Worcester, 15 years ago to play college football. But I ultimately expanded my network to all these people that live in the state and grew up around here. And this kid is one of those people. So we're basically working on good faith where he's able to help raise the money in the capital to help, build this business out. It's likewise with, the graduate school I went to. There's a professor there that did the same thing. He basically did some work on good faith for me. And I'm happy to say that, with the network that I had, we're able to build value in this business without having to put in like a ton of money. And that's just, again, just being in a position to be able to take help and be able to take the resources that are available. But yeah, I mean, the guy that helped us tremendously. His name is Joe Correa, and we played college football together. And I take pride in being able to say that, because if it wasn't for going back home to the kid introducing me to football and then getting into college, I wouldn't have met that dude, and I wouldn't be standing here with you guys today.
Love it.
No, absolutely. So I think, and we talked a little bit about the municipal social programs. I think locally, and this is kind of my mindset. Again, I'm from Connecticut. So now what I'm able to do is I'm able to get all this experience and go to a market, go back home to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where they do not have adult use cannabis, and where I am known for that kid that played sports, ran a family business, and now I have some influence because I know what I'm talking about when it comes to this cannabis. At least I think I know what I'm talking about when it comes to this cannabis thing. And now I can help say, hey, these are the programs that we need to institute and how we can help make them work to make it a more equitable market back in my hometown. So I think that's very important for any of those that are known in their local town that are on this call for, being an athlete or just being known as someone that's influential in their local market. You really got to tap into your local government, the local city officials, and get their perspective and to recognize that, there have been harms that have been done by prohibition, and we can really make some strong change. So the network and to find out people's views there's a correlation between that and the municipal social programs. I think for anyone that's in leadership positions, whether it's your city councils, whether it's your selectmen, whether it's your mayor, your city manager, you really have to get a strong hold on how they perceive marijuana. Are they only talking about medical cannabis? Are they talking about, these big money lobbyists that come in? Because that's when it's your responsibility to interject and say, hey, no, we want this to be a local market. We want to recognize the harms that have been done in prohibition and think of creative ways to help institute and restore those issues that have been done. And then the last point I think we can get to, and is probably the easiest point, and it's not just exclusive to cannabis, is you got to know who you're spending your money with. That was one of the biggest things I did when it came to popping things off here in this market with my business, is that I would have to research these other companies that I was up against. And I kid you not, there's $1 billion company right down the street. Those $1 billion companies, you look at their C-suite, look at their founders. If they don't have people of color, if they don't have women representing them, then you know what they're all about. They're all about profit. So why should I, as a consumer and even as a buyer, because ultimately we're gonna have to work together to buy product from them or to manufacture products with them, we have to understand that our money goes a long way. So if someone's not representing the culture correctly, if someone's not being fair to those who have been harmed, if there is no diversity in their organization, then I'm not spending my money, my wholesale dollars to buy, thousands of dollars worth of cannabis from them. And I'm also not going to go there to spend my money to buy, like I said, on the consumer level as well. And I want to make clear that, again, that's not just for cannabis. I think that's very relevant now to the day and the time that we're in, is you just have to be careful who you spend your money with, because, you know, it has to be a purpose. There has to be more than just profits. There has to be some social good that's out as well.
That's right. That's right. And truly, where we prioritize our lives and our resources tells a lot about how we stand out and stand up for solidarity. I mean, it is a very strong indication of how we believe the world should look from here.
Absolutely.
I'm going to do a quick time check, Ulysses. Do you have a hard stop at 4 Eastern, or do you have a minute to go a bit past?
No, we can go a bit past. I actually,
okay.
I got one more. This is it, pretty much the last.
Okay, awesome. All right, perfect. I just wanted to share that. I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer so we can field some questions as well. But thank you so much. This is awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we were talking a little bit about the importance of women, and I kind of talked a little bit about like having full sisters, having a strong, mom who was very, very supportive. And then this is my business partner. So we, again, are in a position to have a company that has a really strong valuation as we continue to raise funds and do our build out. And, I'm just very, again, in a good position to do some really good things, but it's not alone. So, I just wanted to kind of interject and throw that in there. And then this is the last slide. You guys can reach, the name of my company is Major Bloom. You can find us on socials, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, the whole nine. And just happy to be here with you guys. And like I said to Delana, definitely here for any questions.
I love it. I did connect with Lori, your business partner.
Really?
Yeah, I did. I'm so excited. And I think it's going to be exciting to think about the type of conversations that come from this, Ulysses. One question that Lisa had, and she has to jump off to another call, was when you look at those restorative justice programs, what has been the major pushback, and where are we finding barriers to that, and what could we do to overcome those barriers?
So the first thing that comes to mind when you say pushback, it is the operators in the space. So I know you had mentioned lobbyists on pharmaceuticals. So, and it gets deep. It's actually kind of a little disturbing, but when cannabis gets legalized, there's a bunch of regulatory bodies that form special interest groups. So usually the folks that write the laws are the ones that are first in line to get licenses to businesses. I mean, that's just how it is. So what happens is those same businesses, now they want to slow down the growth to protect their profits. So who is giving pushback now? I'll give you an example. There's a group in Cambridge, very well capitalized group in Cambridge, and they started off as a medical group. So that means that they were only serving medical patients cannabis. Now, when adult use got instituted, now what they want to do is convert their license from medical to adult use. And Cambridge was like, hold on, we don't want big money here. We want local people, those who have been harmed by prohibition, those who are in the economic empowerment program or in the social equity program. We want them to get licenses first. Now, what did that big money lobbyist group do? They sued the city of Cambridge because of social equity. And that's messed up. So that's when I say, and those are the same guys that are knocking on our door talking about, oh, we can provide you with flour. We got pounds, barrels of weed that we can sell to you guys. But it's like, listen, you're trying to deter the program that we're in, yet you want to work with us. So that's when I say it's intentional, that like we are not going to spend dollars with groups who are marginalized, marginalizing these, these equity programs, and who don't care about the purpose of, like restoring. And I mean that. We're not going to do business with groups that don't care. And they want to do that. They want to use this as like the tokenism and say, oh, we're working with these guys, but they don't really care. You know what I mean? So, and there's just more on that. This is why we start to see like New York, the state of New York, and New Jersey, they're going to have a tough time legalizing because they have the worst disparities. When I said 4 times likely for blacks to get arrested, in New Jersey, it's like 18 times in some counties.
Wow.
It's like, it's ridiculous, but I hope that answered your question. I can sometimes go
no, it's really good data. What could you leave us with that you'd say are maybe 1 to 3 calls to action for us all to walk away with and consider, just to kind of put a bow on the things that you've shared, because you've shared a ton of data with us, lots of great history. I'd love to get into the whole like follow the dollar conversation. So maybe we come back and have you talk about the economic currency and the history behind the post Jim Crow era. I know there's a lot there that we didn't have time for today,
Right.
but what would you say were the 1 to 3, like, you know, CTAs, calls to action for all of us to think about as we consider this conversation with you?
Absolutely. So I think the number one thing that comes to mind is being local and intentional local. I personally, like, I probably wouldn't have a license for this location if I didn't show up. This is pre-COVID, but show up to City Hall and like hold the city manager's office accountable for working with local, diverse, Black and brown businesses. So I would say that's one, is being very, very present. If it wasn't for COVID, I'd still probably, like, it's one of my favorite things to do is just pop up on people and show my face. So I think being present is, again, probably the number one thing. I would say the number two thing and just kind of going back to what I said before, just know who you spend your money with. At this point, since we are licensed and there is value in our company, there are a lot of people who reach out to us that want to do business, and we are very, very, I don't want to say reluctant, but like we're very intentional about who we work with. So at this point, we don't want to be in a position to work with, the companies that don't really care about social equity and don't care about restorative justice. So, and again, I think it's the same on a consumer level where, you have a lot of power with your dollar, so spend it wisely.
So I heard engage locally, look for intentional social justice advocates in your society, and to invest in those who do those things. Watch your dollars. We can even say promote
Absolutely.
Black and brown owned organizations. Look for those who stand up this
Absolutely.
way and promote the folks who are being targeted and have been affected from an injustice over time. So that's how we right wrongs, by overextending the way we extend justice today. Yeah,
Absolutely,
I love it.
Absolutely. And I think part of it too is, I think part of it's also like good faith and actually like buying into the vision, because as I said before, the kid that I played college football with, who's well off, him and his family are millionaires, helping to raise funds for this project. Because they know who I am, you know what I mean? Like, so I think, and they see that, especially in this time that we're in.
Uh-oh, I think we lost him at the last minute there, guys. Maybe not. I still see him, but I see his oh, there we go.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, it's my.
That's all right. It's all right. It's all good. What I was thinking about when we lost you for a second, Ulysses, is that you're talking about how important it is that our brand shows up, right? You've developed relationships, right. You've connected with people, and you have a consistent belief in how your brand is executed against your priorities. So that's a good thing for us all to think about. What do we look like, and how does our brand show up and present itself on a day in and day out basis? Oh, lost him again. Oh, there he comes.
Sorry.
Oh no.
It's all good. It's all right. We got him. We've got to run. I know it's late, but Ulysses,
right.
Thank you. Anybody have any last minute questions for Ulysses? Otherwise, we'll just say a big thank you from athLEDA, and definitely would love to have you back if you're open to it. I know that there's possibly another set of conversations again around the currency and the economic impacts, and how we can continue to promote social justice across this nation and on this world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be
for that. I support you guys.
Oh,
yes.
So I was going to say that would be a super interesting conversation to have, the economic one, because it is. It's such a huge thing.
Yeah, the dollar
Absolutely. I'd be happy to join. So definitely feel free to reach out.
Okay, we sure will. Ulysses, thank you so much for today. You've meant a lot to us, and we look forward to standing arm to arm and shoulder to shoulder with you as we continue this fight together.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Blair.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Ulysses.
Thank you.